Welcome to the lecture on Selections from John Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture, we'll be looking at a classical distinction in the philosophy of perception and philosophy of mind between direct and indirect perceptual realism. No doubt you have at some point thought about how perception works, some of the puzzles concerning perception, and almost certainly when you've thought about these things, you've assumed, without argumentation, either direct or indirect perceptual realism, and oftentimes people inadvertently conflate direct and indirect perceptual realism and end up with interesting conclusions, but nonetheless conclusions that are based on a fundamental confusion of a foundational distinction between two different perceptual positions. So in this lecture, we'll be getting clear on these positions, getting clear on their implications and the arguments for them, and attaching them to specific thinkers throughout the history of philosophy. Says Locke, knowledge, as has been said, lying in the perception of the agreement or disagreement of any of our ideas, it follows from, hence, that we can have knowledge no further than we have ideas. It is evident the mind knows not things immediately, but only by the intervention of the ideas it has of them. Our knowledge, therefore, is real only insofar as there is a conformity between our ideas and the reality of things. Even though this is a very short passage from Locke's essay, it shows us a number of different interconnected things about Locke's philosophy. There are metaphysical and ontological positions put forward here about the existence of ideas in our minds. There are perceptual positions put forward here about what it is that we're aware of and how we're aware of those things. There are epistemological positions put forward here about the scope of our knowledge and when and how we can have knowledge, and there's a theory about how all three of these things relate to one another. So again, even though this is a very short passage, there's quite a bit going on here, and this shows you that oftentimes philosophy can seem very intuitive, can seem very obvious and perhaps even simple, but when you dig just a little bit closer, take just a little bit of time with the text, there's quite a bit more hiding underneath there. And even if it is obvious or intuitive, arguments need to be given for these particular positions, and the implications of the arguments and the positions need to be spelled out. And that's what we'll be doing in this lecture with this particular quotation. First, a little about John Locke. John Locke was a British Enlightenment philosopher, political theorist, and physician. He was alive for a good part of the 1600s, the 17th century, from 1632 to 1704. He was the first of the Enlightenment empiricists. Empiricists are philosophers who take a particular position on knowledge that claims that all of our knowledge derives from experience or sensory experiences or episodes that we have with respect to the world. Locke is perhaps most famous outside of philosophy for his political writings and is called justifiably the father of liberalism. Now, that's not liberalism, a particular doctrinal position in American politics, but liberalism, an overarching view about the relationship between the state and the people. Locke's claims in the short passage that we just looked at encompass theses in the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of perception, so it would behoove us to briefly get clear on what the philosophy of mind and philosophy of perception are. So what is the philosophy of mind? Philosophers of mind are concerned with what minds are, what minds can do, and how minds are able to do the specific things that they're claimed to be able to do. Some, but not all, of the questions that philosophers of mind ask are: 1. What's the nature of mind, the fundamental essence of it? 2. What kind of substance is the mind? Is it material, immaterial, What sorts of laws is it thereby subject to? 3, what's the relation between minds and bodies? If the mind is physical, does it relate to the physical body in the same way as other physical things relate to the physical body? If the mind is immaterial, how does it relate to a physical thing like the body? 4, what are the different sorts of mental states? We're familiar with things like beliefs, emotions, experiences. Are there other ones? How are they related to each other? What are the contents of mental states when you believe something? What is inside that belief that makes it the particular belief that it is? And further, what is it that makes it a belief at all? 6, what's the relation between the mind and the world? The primary relation between mind and world is generally known as intentionality or aboutness. Mental states can be about the world in certain ways, so how is that possible? And finally, what's the nature of consciousness? When we're concerned with the philosophy of perception, the primary sorts of questions that we're concerned with here are questions like 4, what are the different sorts of mental states? 5, what are the contents of mental states? 6, what's the relation between mind and world? And 7, what's the nature of consciousness? Some people see philosophy of perception as a separate subdiscipline in philosophy. Some people see it as a sub-subdiscipline under the philosophy of mind. So let's see what the philosophy of perception is. Philosophers of perception are concerned with questions of the nature and content of perception, as well as of its relationship to belief and knowledge. Some, but not all, of the questions that are asked by philosophers of mind are: 1, what are the different sources of perception and what are their relations to one another? So we know about the 5 Aristotelian senses: sight, taste, smell, hearing, and touch. What are the relations between those senses? What are some of the other senses? Are there non-sensory ways of perceiving things? What's the relationship between the sense organs and perception? Sometimes people think that perception happens in the sense organs, but we know that this is a misinformed view. Perception doesn't just happen in an eye. Perception has to happen between the eye and the mind, and maybe something else comes in here. So what's the relation between those things? What's the relation between antecedent mental states and perception? Some people think that based on beliefs or theories that you already hold, you'll actually perceive the world differently even before you interpret the world. This is called the theory-ladenness of perception and is a popular and important theory in the philosophy of science. So what is the relationship that underlies the relation between mental states and perception? 4, what are the contents of perception? When you perceive something, what's in that state of perception? 5, what's the relation between the contents of perception and the world? Are the worldly things part of perception, or do the worldly things just affect the things that are part of perception? 6, what's the relation between perception and consciousness? Are perceptual states always represented or delivered to consciousness, or can we be perceiving things that we're not conscious of? And 7, what's the relation between perception and epistemology? In this particular lecture, we are going to be interested specifically in questions like 4 and 5 and 6. Now, you might think, well, can't we do philosophy of perception not by doing philosophy at all, but by just doing some empirical science about how the eye works or how the brain works? Well, not quite. The philosophy of mind and empirical science, while they deal with similar topics, ask different questions and have different methodologies, so it further behooves us to look at the relationship between the philosophy of mind and empirical science. Philosophers of mind are generally interested in the nature of and possibilities for particular mental states, while empirical scientists who study the brain and related phenomena are generally interested in the physical underpinnings or correlates of mental states. Now, neither the philosopher of mind nor the empirical scientist just makes the mere assumption that the mind equals the brain. In order to assume or come to the conclusion that the mind equals the brain, we would need to have some philosophical argument for that claim and not just a mere assumption. And so you can see that in order to do empirical science at all, if empirical science was going to claim that it was relevant to questions about minds, we would need to do some philosophy first. And finally, while there is some overlap, as I've said, between the topics studied by philosophers of mind and empirical scientists, the particular questions asked are distinct, and even further, the methodologies employed are distinct. So neither the philosopher of mind nor the empirical scientist needs to claim that they have all the answers, nor do they need to claim that there's something fundamentally misguided about the other discipline in order to do what they do. And the philosophy of perception is either part of the philosophy of mind or at least relevantly related to the philosophy of mind. So while it's important to do empirical science to know, for example, how our ears or eyes function, in order to solve the fundamental questions of what perception is and how it's related to the sense organs and what the contents of perception are and how it's related to consciousness, we need to do philosophy rather than empirical science. So let's dive right in to the philosophy of perception. The first central distinction that philosophers of perception make is between perceptual realism and perceptual anti-realism. And this distinction is going to help us understand some of the other things that we're talking about in this lecture. So even though this isn't primarily a lecture on the relation between realism and anti-realism when it comes to perception, we need to understand these concepts in order to understand the rest of what's going on. Perceptual realism is the position that perception is very often of or about the world, even if that perception is sometimes distorted or mistaken. Now, you might say, well, isn't that just the position that everybody already holds, that when we perceive the world, and even if we're sometimes wrong, even if we sometimes get things a little bit confused, we're perceiving the world? Well, you might think so, but there's a long tradition in the philosophy of perception, philosophy of mind, more broadly, that is not realist with respect to perception. With respect to perceptual realism, there are two main forms of perceptual realism. We'll be looking at these momentarily. These are known as direct and indirect perceptual realism. So just given the names, direct and indirect perceptual realism are both forms of perceptual realism. Anti-realism, on the other hand, when it comes to perception, is the position that perception is not of the world. Even if it might seem to be of the world, it's not. Now, this isn't the claim that we sometimes get things wrong. It's the claim that perception just isn't the sort of thing that is about the world at all, and that usually perception is about some other sort of thing. Now, what sort of thing might perception be about? Well, perception might just be about hallucinations or merely internally generated perceptual or apparently perceptual states, or maybe perception is just about non-physical or non-material ideas in minds. So particular versions of what are called skepticism and idealism are versions of perceptual anti-realism, and you can see why here. They're claiming that it's not the world that perception aims at. It's at either nothing, if we're just getting things incorrect all the time, or it's at internally generated hallucinatory states, for example, or it's at just other ideas and never about the world. And notice that I've said here that certain but not all forms of skepticism and idealism are versions of anti-realism. Sometimes people make these positions, skepticism and idealism, far too simple. They think all the versions of the position are similar and that they're all versions of anti-realism, but that's not true. In fact, most positions that are skeptical or idealistic are not versions of perceptual anti-realism. So again, don't make the mistake that some people make of thinking that all versions of skepticism or idealism are versions of anti-realism. Now, this lecture is not primarily on anti-realism, so let's turn to perceptual realism, and in particular, the two different forms of perceptual realism known as direct and indirect perceptual realism. First, to direct perceptual realism. Direct perceptual realism, also sometimes called naive realism, is the position that perception is of the world and that what is immediately perceived is the world itself. Now, I should note here that that term naive in naive realism doesn't mean uninformed, immature, childish. It means common sense or the position that's not complicated. And indeed, direct perceptual realism seems to be a very common sense or uncomplicated picture. However, arguing for it has turned out to be very difficult. Now, there are many different forms of perceptual realism, but they all share the thesis that there is no intermediary between perceiver and the thing perceived. So if you're the perceiver and you're perceiving the world, you immediately or directly perceive the thing perceived. So if you are perceiving a horse, you stand in a direct perceptual relation to the horse. Nothing gets in between your seeing the horse and the horse itself. That's just what it means to directly or immediately perceive the actual world. Let's compare this to indirect perceptual realism. According to indirect perceptual realism, or what is sometimes known as representational realism, perception is of the world, the same as with direct perceptual realism, since these are both forms of realism. But what's immediately perceived is a mental copy of the world. And the mental copy of which we're immediately aware is also sometimes called a representation. That's where this term representational realism comes from. Or it can be called an idea. We saw that in Locke and a number of the other Enlightenment philosophers who were successors of Locke or contemporaries of Locke use the same term, idea, or even sometimes it's called a veil of perception. So the thought here is that if you're perceiving the world, what you directly perceive isn't the world itself, but some mental representation, mental copy, idea, veil of perception that stands between you and the world perceived. So take our example of you perceiving the horse again. If indirect perceptual realism is true and you're perceiving a horse, what you are immediately aware of is this mental representation. Now, in the diagram that I've given you here on the screen, I've put the mental representation outside of the subject's head just to make this thing big enough so that you can see it and to accentuate that what's going on here is that the perceiver perceives the representation. Most people would think that the representation is actually a mental item that exists in the head or in the brain, and the thought is that whatever thing you are that's doing the perceiving perceives some representation, idea of an object that's in your brain, and then that object is related to the object that you actually are perceiving out in the world, but you're only perceiving the object out in the world indirectly via this representation, this idea, this mental copy. And that thing is the intermediary. So to distinguish between direct and indirect perceptual realism, you can say when I experience the world, am I immediately experiencing the world, or is what I immediately experience some representational or ideal intermediary that stands between me and the thing perceived. Now, both of these views are pretty intuitive. Why should we think that indirect perceptual realism is true? Well, the standard argument, and there are a number of arguments, but the standard argument that's been given in favor of indirect perceptual realism is known as the argument from illusion. It's called a number of other things, but the most famous name for it is the argument from illusion. That argument looks like this. Premise 1, we sometimes see distortions, illusions, and hallucinations. Premise 2, in a distortion, illusion, or hallucination, the perceived properties of an object don't match the real properties of that object. So, for example, imagine seeing a stick that's in water. The stick appears bent, but the stick isn't actually bent. So you're perceiving something incorrectly. There's a distortion. And you can even imagine something further. Perhaps you've taken a drug and you're hallucinating, or perhaps something's happened and you are experiencing something illusory. Well, what's going on there is you're not experiencing the world correctly. Something has interfered with your perception such that what you appear to see isn't what's actually outside of you. Premise 3, if we sometimes perceive unreal properties, then what we perceive isn't the world itself, but some intermediary capable of indirectly representing the world itself. It's not as though when you have distorted perception or you have an illusion or a hallucination, the world changes. It's that your perception changes. Well, what about your perception changes? This argument says what changes is the thing that you're immediately aware of, an idea or a representation. The representation or the idea or the mental copy is somehow skewed or incorrect, so when you become aware of that thing, that's what the illusion amounts to. And therefore, says this argument, what we perceive is not the world itself, but some intermediary that's capable of incorrectly representing the world itself. Notice how powerful this argument is. It goes from something that we're all familiar with, getting things wrong in perception, our perceptual experience just not being correct, it being illusory. And it infers from that a metaphysical claim and a philosophy of mind claim about how perception works and what are the objects that are operative in perception. Now this, as I've said, is the most famous argument in favor of indirect perceptual realism, but there are a couple of arguments against indirect perceptual realism as well that are equally powerful, if not more so. Let's look at two of those. One is known as the argument from incorrect reference against indirect perceptual realism. That looks like this. Premise 1, at least sometimes we can refer to the perceived world. This seems obvious. If, for example, I'm looking at a table and I think to myself, there's a table, or I say to somebody, there's a table, what I'm doing is referring to the perceived world, and what's allowing me to do that is my perception of the world. However, if indirect perceptual realism is true, then what we perceive isn't the world itself. That's just the thesis of indirect perceptual realism, nothing to argue with there. Premise 3, if what we perceive isn't the world itself, then attempting to reference the perceived world is, in fact, referencing what's perceived and not the world. So think about this. If what you perceive isn't actually the world, but is a mental copy or a representation, an intermediary that stands between you, the perceiver, and the thing that's represented in perception, then when you try to refer to the world, what you actually end up referring to is a mental representation, or an idea, or a veil of perception. That's all you can ever succeed in referring to. Therefore, indirect perceptual realism can't be true. If it's true that we sometimes refer to the world, but if indirect perceptual realism would make it impossible for us to refer to the world, then indirect perceptual realism can't be true. Now, it might seem easy to get around this by saying, no, what I'm talking about when I talk about reference is some sort of indirect reference that goes through the mental representation or the idea, the veil of perception. And I'll leave it to you to work out exactly how difficult it is to make sense of a view of indirect reference that works that way. Now let's look at what I take to be an even more powerful and intuitive argument against the position of indirect perceptual realism. This is known as the argument from perceptual regress. Now, a regress is the sort of thing where you have an item, and then in order to make sense of or even have that item, you need to have some previous item, and in order to have that, you need to have some previous item, and in order to have that, you need to have some previous item, and so on into infinity. Some regresses aren't problematic, some regresses are. According to this particular argument, indirect perceptual realism leaves us with a problematic regress. So assume for the sake of argument that indirect perceptual realism is true. What would happen if indirect perceptual realism were true? Well, if indirect perceptual realism is true, then when for any object, call it x sub 0, is perceived, it's only indirectly perceived, and x sub 1, some mental representation or thing that stands between x sub 0 and the perceiver, is what's actually perceived. This is just a formalization of what the indirect perceptual realist already believes, that anytime there's perception, something stands between the perceiver and the thing perceived. However, if indirect perceptual realism is true, then when x1 is perceived, and remember x1 here is supposed to be the mental representation that stands between us, the perceiver, and the world, when x1 is perceived, it's only indirectly perceived. And x2, some further mental representation, is actually perceived. So now, in order to perceive the world, we have a mental representation, but in order to perceive that mental representation, we need a mental representation of the mental representation, because there is no such thing as experience of something perceived that doesn't have a mental representation that stands between the perceiver and the thing perceived. And again, if indirect perceptual realism is true, then when x2, which is the mental representation of the mental representation, is perceived, it can only be indirectly perceived. And x3 is what's actually perceived. That's a mental representation of a mental representation of a mental representation of the world, and so on ad infinitum to infinity. Now, notice that the indirect perceptual realist can't get out of this by saying, oh, no, when I perceive the world, something needs to stand between me and the world, call that a mental representation. But when I perceive that mental representation, that thing is just perceived directly. Because if direct perception is possible, then we don't need indirect perceptual realism at all. So if the indirect perceptual realist is willing to admit or countenance direct perception of anything, of something, a mental representation, then the indirect perceptual realist should just say, oh, well, when we perceive the world, we're directly perceiving the world. There's no reason to put a mental representation between us and the world and then stop there. Either it's the case that we directly perceive the world, or it's the case that there are mental representations between mental representations between mental representations between mental representations, and on and on. So, if there's an infinite regress of intermediaries between the world and the perceiver, then perception is impossible. Notice why this would be the case. Anytime you try to perceive something, you need a mental representation. Anytime you try to perceive that, you need a mental representation. And so you've got this infinite regress of mental representations such that perception can never even get started. But perception's not impossible. So notice what happened here. If we assume that indirect perceptual realism is true, then we end up with the thesis that perception is impossible. But since perception's not impossible, we can throw out our initial assumption and conclude that indirect perceptual realism is false. Now, it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to try to make sense of direct perceptual realism. It seems a little bit too simple, but it also seems as though it's not making sense of the phenomena of illusion, hallucination, distortion. So here's just one way that a direct perceptual realist might respond to the argument from illusion that we looked at before, and that is the most powerful and well-known argument in the indirect perceptual realists' arsenal. And as I said, this is just one of the many different positions that's out there that can adopt direct perceptual realism and respond positively to the argument from illusion. This position is known as disjunctivism. Disjunctivism in the philosophy of perception is the position that veridical or truthful or accurate perception and non-veridical apparent perception, that appears to be of something but isn't. These are very different mental processes. And although the subject, the person who's doing the perceiving, may not be able to tell subjectively from the inside, from the first person perspective, which process is going on, one or the other process is going on. In veridical perception, the perceptual and cognitive mechanisms of the subject are functioning properly, while in non-veridical apparent perception, there's been some sort of perceptual or cognitive breakdown such that the subject is undergoing some separate mental process altogether. And the disjunctivist concludes from this that it would be a mistake to claim that we can draw conclusions about veridical perception from cases of non-veridical apparent perception. We don't usually draw conclusions about how things function from how they're malfunctioning when they break down. When something breaks down, some completely different process is happening. So here's an analogy for you. Consider a bicycle and a unicycle. Now, they have similar functions and they have similar parts and they work in similar ways, but they are different sorts of vehicles. And it would be a mistake to draw conclusions about how, for example, a bicycle works or about how bicycles are ridden from unicycle riding. Now, if we can figure out some things that are the same between the two of them, then we can draw some conclusions. But if all we know is that bicycle riding and unicycle riding have similar components to them, we can't thereby draw conclusions about bicycle riding from our knowledge of unicycle riding. So to bring this analogy back to disjunctivism, even if we know that sometimes our perceptual mechanisms break down and we appear to see things that don't exist, that doesn't tell us anything about perception. That tells us something about what happens when perception breaks down and isn't functioning properly. So, who are the direct perceptual realists in the history of philosophy? Well, many people today are direct perceptual realists. Most epistemologists who give theories that are realistic theories that say that we can know the world at least have some theory of perception that is very similar to, if not identical to, some version of direct perceptual realism. Now, the most famous direct perceptual realist to come out of the early modern tradition, a modern philosopher, is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant's version of direct perceptual realism was almost so simple as to be baffling to people, and many people did seriously misunderstand Kant's direct perceptual realism when it was put forward in his book, The Critique of Pure Reason. Kant was an 18th century philosopher, lived through much of the 1700s, and his philosophy is notoriously difficult to understand, but this much is sure, and this much is agreed upon by Kant scholars. When we perceive the world, our perception is of what Kant calls phenomena, or just even simpler, perceivable things. That is the experienceable world, and our minds themselves, and not some intermediary, represent these phenomena by being directly aware of them. So the fact that Kant uses these terms phenomena and representation, that has sometimes led people to misunderstand Kant's perceptual and epistemological views, and to think that he is an indirect or representational perceptual realist. He's not. He's a direct perceptual realist that says when the mind perceives phenomena, or the way that the world is, the mind itself and not some intermediary is the thing that represents the world. And his version of perceptual realism, direct perceptual realism, was very influential and continues to be influential to this day. So in this lecture, we looked at a paradigmatic statement of indirect perceptual realism from the early modern Enlightenment philosopher John Locke. This statement said that when we are aware of the world, we're never directly aware of the world, but only directly aware of ideas or representations or mental intermediaries that stand between us and the perceiving thing and the world, the thing perceived. We saw that the central argument for this is the argument from illusion, but we also saw that direct perceptual realists can make sense of the argument from illusion, and that one of the ways they can do this is by adopting what's known as a disjunctivist theory of perception. Even further, there are serious problems for indirect perceptual realism in that it seems as though the indirect perceptual realist has to wrestle with a theory of how we can possibly reference the world when all we're ever aware of is not the world itself, but intermediaries that stand between us and the world. And even further, it seems like once we start claiming that whenever we're aware of something, what we're aware of isn't the thing we're aware of itself, but some intermediary, we immediately are launched on an infinite, vicious regress that makes perception impossible. To my mind, the best thing to do is to try very hard to defend some position of direct perceptual realism and see indirect perceptual realism as a distant second place view on perception that at least preserves realism, but at a tremendous cost. Thank you.